Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my NACL week number 3 overview and analysis video here in the summer split. We are really starting to get a good idea of where these teams are landing. By the end of this week, everybody will have played at least 2 series here so far in the NACL. I think Full Fearless has definitely changed the way that some of these teams want to approach some of these games. Of course, a lot of the rosters, basically all of them, are different in some way, shape, or form, so getting a clearer idea of where these teams are landing is always good. If you want to know my thoughts on the first couple of weeks, check out the playlist up in the iCard as per usual. Week 1, Week 2, they're going to be up there, as well as my pre-split primer that I did, kind of talking about what I expected from a lot of these teams. So far, it's kind of been chalk, but this week was definitely a lot more interesting, so I'm excited to get into it. If you are as well, let me know down in the comments section below. But without further ado, let's jump into it. If you are new here, what we do on this channel is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, we will also be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10 at the end of the week, kind of discussing what direction I think a lot of these teams are going in, whether they're getting better or whether, they're maybe underperforming at the current moment, whether or not I think they could improve or, maybe won't hold on to that kind of pressure moving forward. It's all going to be an interesting discussion, but with all that being said, let's jump right into the content. I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the beginning of the video, and that means starting off with day number 1, and we actually had probably my most I guess you could say hyped series of the week here. Starting us off, it's Team Liquid Challengers taking on Supernova, and TLC is going to pick up a really big win here. These are two teams that I think are very similar in terms of their expectations right now. Both aren't necessarily contending for top 1 or top 2, with the best teams in the league kind of separating themselves, but both have aspirations to get there by the end of the split. I think it's realistic for both of them to be in that conversation. Supernova obviously had last week off, and they didn't do particularly well in the previous playoffs, and so they're really looking for a bounce back, making some changes to their roster. But Team Liquid staying with their group of 5. They've always overperformed as the split especially has gone further along. Their playoff performers, it's how this org has always been able to operate, and they continue to look really good. And in fact, they've looked really good at the start of this split just in general. Even in their 1 series loss, you could maybe argue that they were the better team last week against DSG, so it's not exactly been that bad of a start to the split for Team Liquid, despite the fact that they're at 2-1. Player of the series was super easy for me. This is going to go to Jenkins. An unbelievable volley bear game in game number 1. That's what he's getting this player of the series for. This was a game-winning kind of performance from him on the volley in game 1. When you talk about this series, game 2, relatively close. Team Liquid did a good job to stay in it. Game 3 was a blowout in favor of Team Liquid, but game 1, really a back and forth affair, and it ended up being really consequential, those plays that were made at the end of the game that put Team Liquid ahead, because if Supernova ends up winning that, obviously they end up winning game number 2. That's a 2-0 sweep for them, and so Liquid being able to pick up that game 1, giving them the option to lose that second game, and obviously bouncing back in game number 3, it ultimately was kind of the decider here. I don't think these two teams are all that far apart. I think we saw that, but Jenkins being as good as he was a huge factor. We'll get to Faisal in a second. I don't think he was miserably bad. I don't think anybody on Supernova was really bad across the entire series, but, I definitely think there was a bit of a gap in the top lane, and Jenkins was a bit better. I've been a bit lower on Jenkins because, typically speaking, he's been good on, his champions, things like the Rumble, the Kennen, the Gnar, the stuff that he really came up through the system with, and I don't think he's played some of the newer, like, more meta top laners, like Cassante or, things in that vein as dominantly, but this was a really good showcase, and it showed that he could really take over games in the team fighting stage, which is really important. Just a really, really good game, in particular in game number 1, but series overall. It's not like he was bad on the Ornn in game number 3 either. The rest of this team was a little bit more well-rounded. I would say across the rest of the series, Roamer continues to look very impressive. The mechanics are clearly still there. I still continue to believe that, mechanically speaking, he's the best mid laner in the NACL. I'm not going to say that he's the best mid in terms of overall, gameplay, because I do think he struggles at being able to create an impact in the mid game in the same way that someone like Spyrax, was able to do super consistently. But you have games like this where it's just so clear what Team Liquid saw in him and why I was hyping him up so much coming over from the Challengers League, where when he gets elite, it is very difficult to actually do anything against him because he is such a talented player. I think Spawn and Kim Down looked really good in this series. Spawn continues to be the kind of AD carry that so long as you can facilitate him, he is going to perform rather well. He's not the most aggressive AD carry in the world. He's kind of built in that same mold as like a Patrick or a Teddy, in some of the other regions where he's going to have good performances if you put good talent around him. He'll look good in situations that are bad as well. It's, individually going to be fine for him, but I'm not necessarily sure you want him to be the best player on your team. I think if he is your second or third option, you're in a really good spot though, because he is phenomenal at execution. Honestly, the player he reminds me of the most, and this is for LEC fans that maybe have been watching, for a couple of years, is Neon. Very similar playstyles in my opinion, and very similar execution. I think they're pretty similar players, and Neon had some success over in the LEC. I think Spawn obviously could have success in the LCS. Things didn't exactly go according to plan, but we talked a lot last year about why that ended up not working out for them. I think it was a playstyle problem, a fit problem on that team in particular. I think Spawn's still a really good player. He's proven that many times over. And Kim Down had a good series. Keel has been great at the start of this year. I think he's probably been this team's best player over the first couple of weeks. Going back to some signature picks here, the Nunu and the Udyr, they ended up working out. I do think he was maybe a bit over-aggressive in some of the plays that he wanted to make, but, for the most part, I think it was generally fine. Jenkins and Spawn were the players that stood out. Roamer was also very, very good. In fact, Roamer might have stood out a tad bit more than Spawn, but the fact that we're talking about the three laners as, which one was better, it's a good sign. And then for Supernova on the other side, I don't think they're going to be too frustrated by this loss in the same way that I don't think Team Liquid was super frustrated by their loss to DSG earlier in the year, last week, because they actually played relatively well. Now, I think it's a bit of a different circumstance because there was a real argument that Team Liquid, even losing that series last week, was the better team against DSG. I don't think there is an argument that Supernova was better than Team Liquid, not after game number 3. I don't think anyone's going to make that argument, but there were good moments, and there were a lot of things to point out that were positive overall. I continue to be very impressed by Toasty. I think he is a player that is going to emerge as one of the better mid laners in the NACL by the end of the year, somebody who can really make a difference for a top tier team, and he might even be able to do that right now. We've seen some really good performances out of him. I think Lens and Diamond are really starting to find their consistency. I was worried about how they were going to play together early on in the split, but it's worked out so far. Kenvi continues to be fine. Again, maybe a little bit over-aggressive, specifically on the Zyra in game number 1, but nobody at this level has really been able to pilot Zyra at a super high capacity. We're seeing the same thing with Nidalee. I will definitely talk about that as we go further along in the week. Nidalee's win rate is astronomically low here in the NACL, but my dead of the series is unfortunately going to go to Faisal in the top lane. I don't even think he played all that bad. I thought he was generally fine here for Supernova, but Jenkins was definitely better, and I think the laning phase in game number 1 was probably the most noticeable in terms of difference between the players. The Skarner was still doing things, and the Cassante in game 2 was still really solid, but Jenkins really was the better top laner, and it was the only matchup that I could really look at and say Supernova needed to be better here, and they just weren't. So I still like Faisal. I think it's fine. Losing to Jenkins, who's also a very good top laner, is not the end of the world. And Supernova, losing in the way that they did here, is not the end of the world. This is still going to be a competitive team, but Team Liquid is very good. To me, this is clearly a top 4 team in the NACL at the moment. They might even be better than that. We'll see what happens when they start going up against teams like FlyQuest and Fear and, teams in that sphere, because I think that it's going to be interesting to see how Team Liquid can respond. But if they were contenders for a title again, like they've been basically every split, I don't think I'm going to be surprised, and I don't think anybody at this point is going to be surprised. And then moving on to our second series here of day number 1, and it's 2 undefeated teams. It's Dragonsteel taking on Blue Otter. And unfortunately for the Otters, Dragonsteel is going to pick up the 2-1 win after the major upset in game number 1. Through the first game of this series, it looked like the crazy upset was going to get pulled off, that Blue Otter was actually way better than any of us expected, that these new teams coming into the NACL were better than a lot of the other new teams coming into the NACL in previous years, that they were going to be able to dominate early on to show why they were able to do so well. And I still think there's a lot of good to take away for Blue Otter in this series, but Dragonsteel is still a little bit of a mountain to climb. They did lose their first game of the split in game number 1, like we said, but the bounce back was incredibly strong. Game number 2 was a really fun one to watch for Dragonsteel fans, but player of the series for me is controversially maybe going to go to Zamudo. I don't think it's controversial that he was amazing in that second game. He's really getting this player of the series because of that Renekton game in game number 2. And I also want to add right now that Renekton, one of those champions that at least so far in Summer Split in particular, basically in every region that I cover, has performed way better than the pick rate that he has. It's really funny because people tend to overvalue Renekton in a lot of different regions. It ends up getting nerfed into the ground and people still pick it, and so the performance ends up dropping off. And then when teams do inevitably move to something else, All of a sudden, Riot ends up giving Renekton some buffs. Some teams are a little bit hesitant to go back around because it was so bad last time they played it, and they got so much flack from the community last time they played it, but when they do pick it up, it ends up working incredibly well, and the cycle ends up continuing. That's probably what's going to happen right now, where Renekton feels like he's in a really, really good spot in terms of top lane champions, and obviously Zamudo's a very good Renekton, but he took over that second game. I mean, just utterly dominated. At times, it felt like he could literally do no wrong in that second game, and so even if he was super questionable in game 1 on the Skarner, where he was not very good at all, and definitely wasn't the carry in game number 3 on the Jax, he was definitely good enough for me to give him player of the series in that second game, because it was probably the most influential game that anybody had from Dragonsteel in this series. I do think the rest of the top side was also a positive. Yuji had another good series. He's probably my favorite for MVP once again. So far into the split, Dragonsteel has continued to dominate, and Yuji has been their best player, at least in my opinion. Spyrax was also very good, was definitely better in the back half of this series. We'll get to Samakin, because honestly, he's another player that I feel really bad for, kind of being negative on this channel in terms of this performance, because generally he was really good for most of this series, but, we'll get to it once we get there. But Spyrax was definitely the more consistent mid laner in this series, and I do think Zyko did a good job in terms of engaging down in the bot lane. If I did have a concern and a question, I wanted to see more out of Scary Jerry. I don't think he was kind of his normal, game-winning kind of self in this series. He was definitely more of a background player. Part of that is him going to the Senna in game number 3, but I don't think he was great on the Kai'Sa in game 2 either. He really wasn't all that good on the Ezreal in game 1. You're allowed to have a down series, but Levitate was probably the better bot laner in this series, and that's really not what you want to see if you're Dragonsteel. I think Jerry will get back on track, but, it's a little bit of a slow start after he wasn't here for week number 1. It's just something to monitor, but at least they were able to pick up the win, and for Otter, I find it hard to find a reason to be upset about this result. Like, obviously, you wish you would have pulled off the victory. You wish you would have closed out this series after going up 1-0, but the fact that you were able to beat Dragonsteel pretty handily, like, kind of dominate them in game number 1, I think that's such a good sign for a new team to the NACL. If they continue to grow and get better, it's going to be a really, really scary proposition for a lot of the top teams to have to go into them, because they are mechanically talented enough to be able to make that difference. The concern and the question was whether or not they would have the same kind of macro as some of these better NACL teams that have a little bit more consistency than they do, and it's kind of been true. At times it's not, though. Unfortunately, dud of the series is going to go to Samakin in the mid lane. I really like Samakin, and he was amazing in game number 1 on the Taliyah. He was generally fine in game number 3 on the Aurelion Sol. He is getting this dud of the series for that game 2 on the Vex, in the same way that Zamudo's getting it, his player of the series for his game 2 on the Renekton. Now, it really pains me to talk about that, because as a Vex player myself, it is very sad. Like, the one time we get to see that champion in pro, it ends up doing literally nothing, just like completely running it down, like not being useful at all in the laning phase, and just really not having any sort of pressure on the map. But, it is what it is. Samakin probably should have gone with a different champion in that second game if you wanted that mid-game priority and the ability to get picks. There are a lot of options in the game right now. I'm not sure Vex is the one I personally would have gone for, even if I do think she's in an okay spot right now, but clearly it didn't end up working out. The Viego was not helping in that situation at all, and, that was the same draft. You go for Corki down in the bot lane, and I'm a big Corki bot lane defender, and I'm somebody that's really kind of pushed that narrative forward of we should be treating Corki more as a flex pick than just as a mid laner right now, and this is not a great example, although Levitate, like I said, was generally the best player on blue in this series. I think Music is definitely going to have a conversation in that regard. He was amazing on the brand in game number 1, and, was generally fine throughout the rest of this series. Rovex did some good things. Quacker, I think, did some good things. I just generally think blue doesn't really have a lot of things to be upset over. If they had played game 2 just slightly cleaner, I think that we could be looking at a completely different story here. If they walked out of this with a win, either in game 2 or game 3, that would have been absolutely massive for them, and it certainly would have turned the standings in the NACL on their head. It really would have made things a lot more chaotic and a lot more interesting. At the end of the day, though, how are you going to be frustrated just barely losing to what a lot of people consensusly kind of consider the best team in the league right now? I think they're going to be just fine, especially because their individual performances were rather good for a majority of this series, but Dragonsteel is going to feel lucky to be able to walk out of this. There are some things that I think they could have improved upon in this series, but this felt more like an outlier. I don't think Jerry is going to play to this level for a majority of the split. I think he's going to be just fine. Zamudo also struggled a bit in game 1, and, he obviously showed that he can bounce back from that. He's a rather inconsistent player, so a couple of things kind of flipping for Dragonsteel that I don't think they necessarily anticipated, but at the end of the day, even with some of those things happening, they still were able to pretty comfortably walk out of this series with a win. And then moving on now here to day number 2 here in week number 3, and we kicked off day number 2 with a series that I think was maybe a tad bit more interesting than expected, but that's only because the team that won didn't win as hard as I thought they would. It's Fear x Starforge taking on AoE Esports, and Fear is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. They do drop game number 2. I think that's what makes it interesting, is that AoE actually was able to pick up a win in this series. I don't think I or a lot of other analysts expected AoE to be able to pick up a win, but, you know, Fear does still get the job done, and they looked really great in their wins. They were definitely the better team. That's not up for debate or anything like that. This wasn't one of those series where it's like, you know, it was really close, and I think it could have gone either way. Like, Fear definitely controlled it, even if they did drop game number 2. But there still is a lot to celebrate when it comes to Fear and how they ended up playing this out. I think that their core is still playing incredibly well. Obviously, it's only the second time we've seen them all year because they had that week 2 off, but, you know, they have stayed in form. That is very clear. Coming off of that week 1 win, they look just as good here. Player of the series is going to go to XU in the jungle. He had a really good series. Specifically, he had a great game 3 on the Nidalee. This was something that I kind of touched upon at the beginning of this week, but Nidalee has not exactly been a super successful pick so far in full Fearless in the NACL. It's not really been piloted all that well, and quite frankly, it's not been good in the LCS either. Really, the only players in the world that have had success on Nidalee so far this year have been Canyon, Kanavi, and Peanut, and if you're not one of those 3, it's typically been a pretty bad choice to at least regularly try and pick Nidalee. Even some of the best junglers in the West have not really had a ton of success on that champion, and so I'm pretty hesitant to recommend it, but XU is clearly a very experienced Nidalee player, and that came out here in game number 3, where he really just dominated the early game. NXI had absolutely no answer. This is the problem with Sejuani and Maokai. I defend those champions a lot. Like, I'm certainly the biggest defender of Sejuani in the entire world. I think she is the most consistent jungler in the game by a ginormous margin, but at the same time, you are going to potentially lose some pressure in the early game if you go into a Nidalee, and you're going to lose some, you know, consistency, I would say, in the late game if you don't pick something like a Karthus or a Brand. And so there are trade-offs to something like a Sej. I just think she adds, you know, game-to-game ease of use, if you will. There's really not a comp that wouldn't want a Sejuani in it, so I think that's typically why I tend to value her a lot as a jungler, but again, when Nidalee ends up working, this is the kind of result you get. I saw some people talking as if XU, for some reason, had like a bad week number 1. Like, he wasn't perfect. He made some plays that were a little bit questionable, but at the end of the day, he was still a major factor into why Fear looked so good in week number 1, and I think he looked even better here in week number 3. So I don't really get what the negative sentiment around XU is. He is an LCS caliber talent, clearly. The rest of this team was really solid in this series. Winthrop is obviously deserving of a shout-out. Birthday series for him here, and he lived up to the hype, the expectation that I think was set on him at the beginning of this series. Just some really good gameplay from him. The Alistair, the Rel, a couple of phenomenal engages that really set up the rest of the team to just completely take over some of these games. Blaze Olive was definitely good. Instinct was really good in this series. I think this was definitely better than he played in week number 1. Wixie and Breezy did not play poor at all. Like, I think that they were generally fine here. They've not exactly been the strongest bot lane in the league so far in 2024, but they're both really good players, and obviously there is a track record that both of them are going to be able to get better, and they don't exactly have the best team around them, so to see Instinct come out and have such a good series, I think is a very good sign. Philip was very good on the top side of the map, going into Barrack, who's obviously subbing in this week. Generally, Fear just looks solid. I don't really have a lot of negatives other than I wish they didn't lose game number 2. I would have felt even better about this series if they ended up taking that second game and that, you know, going 2-0, going 4-0 to start this split. I think that would have been even more interesting and more exciting for me, but it's like, at that point, you're just grasping at straws. Like, you're looking for a reason to be upset. They're 4-1. They're 2-0. This is one of the best teams in the NACL, and I certainly don't regret putting them into my top 3. And then for AoE on the other side, this might be the worst team in the NACL. They really just don't have a lot going for them right now. Barrack is in the top lane. You know, it was fine. He was generally fine. He certainly wasn't the problem in the series. I continue to think that their problem is consistency because their jungle mid just isn't consistent at all. NXI is going to get dud of the series here. He has been really bad to start this split, and generally he has not looked good in quite a few years. I think there was some optimism that perhaps getting back into the jungle role would be positive for him, where he really broke out in the first place, you know, role swapping back from support, but it has not necessarily been the case for him. He has been not very good to start this split. He's been out jungled in basically all 3 of their series. I think Cupid is a really interesting player in the mid lane because his good games are so good. Like, the Talia game here in game 2 is really solid. The Anivia, obviously, last week looked really good, but the bad games are also just so incredibly noticeable, and it's just really difficult to try and, figure things out. I think he is settling in a bit. The Orianna, the Ahri, they weren't as bad as some of the bad games have been in previous series. Like last week, he was really good on the Anivia. The rest of that series was kind of a disaster. I think Cupid generally was definitely better this series. He's hopefully trying to get a bit more comfortable, but, this team just doesn't have the high-end upside. Even with Wixie and Breezy, I think playing generally fine. Wixie was able to get resources in this series. Breezy, I think, did a much better job at being able to actively be aggressive on the map. They just don't really have the playmakers to go out and, generate their own advantages going up against teams like Fear x Starforge. Fear has a clear game plan. They have players with the mechanical skill to both win early and execute in the mid game, and AoE just doesn't really have a response to that, even when they are playing well. So I think this loss is really eye-opening. Them actually not making any major errors and still losing, I think, is definitely not an ideal circumstance to be in, and it might make them the worst team right now in the NACL. But for Fear, they are one of the best. They are going to be able to compete, in my opinion, with Dragonsteel, with FlyQuest, with Team Liquid, these other teams that are going to be in the upper echelon. Wherever you want to put them in that cluster, I think is fair, but the 2-0 start to the split, the 4-1 start to the split, it's definitely indicative of the power level here. And then moving on to our final series of the week here, and this is certainly one of the more interesting ones to talk about. It's Winthrop University taking on Disguised, and Winthrop picks up a 2-0 win. Not only do they beat DSG, not only do they win their first series here in the NACL, but they do it in 2-0 fashion, both games very much going their way. DSG did put up a little bit of a fight. There was definitely some moments in this series that I think you're looking at and going, yeah, DSG was okay there, but they could not finish the job. And generally speaking, it's the same story as what we were talking about last week in their win over Team Liquid. This team looked basically the same in this series, where there were good performances, there were players on the team that looked really solid for them, but the overall package, not only the macro, but the weak links, unfortunately, right now of the team are just not working out. There seems to be one or two players every single series that end up just really underperforming, and I think the frustrating part is it doesn't even really seem to be consistent who those players are. It just feels like every so often, every series, you're going to get one or two players that just do not step up on DSG. This was a problem they had in the spring split as well when they really underachieved in the regular season. People forget, but they almost missed playoffs entirely before going on that big playoff run. So, things aren't working out for them, very similar to what happened in spring. And for Winthrop, this is a massive win. This is really kind of an establishing win. I think I'm going to be a little bit of a dissenting opinion in the way that I say this, but I don't think this is as game-breaking as what I think a lot of other people out there are making this out to be right now. DSG is certainly not a bad team, but they're really not a great team. At least they haven't shown any semblance of consistency. They have their own individual flaws. Beating them is not the most earth-shattering win in the world. It wouldn't have been Blue going out and beating Dragonsteel. That would have been shocking. That would have been unbelievable for me. DSG is a very beatable team, and so I'm glad Winthrop was able to take advantage of that, but I don't know if this secures them as a top 4 team. I think some people are trying to make it out to be after this win. So we'll talk about that, but I do want to give them credit because they played phenomenal in this series, specifically in game number 2, where I thought it was just significantly more stable for them. Player of the series, pretty no-brainer, gonna go to Winnie. He was so vital towards the end of game 1 on the Karthus, was really good on the Lilia as well. He was really solid in this series overall, and it's no secret on this channel that I've been a little bit hesitant to kind of crown Winnie as one of the better junglers in the league. There have just been a couple of inconsistent moments that have held me back from saying that he's somebody that I, fully believe in on a game-to-game basis, but those highs are absolutely still there, and I think this core of slew players that they have here, Winnie, Darkwings, Aaron, Skytech, obviously the 3 in the middle having played together on Wildcard as well, bringing Skytech in from slew, and Denethor, staying on, being the Winthrop guy here in the top lane. This is a much more cohesive roster, I think, for Winnie, and I think if he was ever going to really step up and be one of the more interesting junglers in the entire league, this could be the split for him to do that. Yukino's not a bad jungler, DSG's not a bad team, and Winnie just was better than them, especially in the back half of game 1 onward. He was okay in the early parts of game 1, but he's Karthus. There's really not a lot that you're supposed to be doing to kind of separate yourself at the beginning of game 1. The time he was supposed to take over, he did, and then he was really good in game number 2, and so I'm really excited to be able to say that. Hopefully he can keep that up. I think Darkwings also looked a lot better in this series. He's always been a bit of an inconsistent mid laner, but somebody who I've I've praised a lot in the past, regardless of what team and what org he has been on. He's been somebody that I've looked at as a positive for a lot of the teams he's ended up playing for. I think he, like I said, can be a bit inconsistent from a game-to-game, perspective, but Young is not a bad mid laner, and quite frankly, Darkwings did a great job of capitalizing on the mistakes that he was making on the other side of this matchup. Darkwings was just straight up better in the 1v1, so that's really cool to see. I think Denethor was much better here in the second series than he was in the first. He looked a little bit nervous. It was a tough matchup. Surdy is obviously somebody looking for revenge against his former teammates in that first matchup. FlyQuest is just generally a team that you don't feel like you can destroy, and so I gave Denethor a pass, even if he wasn't particularly good in their Week 2 matchup, but here against DSG, he looked really solid. Tenacity is, not a huge step down from Surdy. He is still a really good player, in my opinion, the second best top laner in the NACL, and Denethor was able to go one-on-one with him, even in some more aggressive matchups. I really like the fact that he's willing to pull out things like the Camille in game number 2 and have it work out. Aaron and Skytech were also solid. I think, generally speaking, they didn't have to do a whole ton this series, but, they were good. I think jungle mid won, and I think, top lane was in a good position, and bot lane was strong as well, especially in some of those late fights, and that's going to be enough for Winthrop to win, and, hopefully they can keep this up. I'm going to take a more wait-and-see approach when it comes to them, but this is still a really nice victory, and for DSG, this is still a really bad loss, even if I try and sit here and say that it's not the most shocking thing in the entire universe. I think DSG, one of those teams that I could conceivably believe could lose to any team in the NACL, that's just the way that they play. Their drafts are still very similar to what they were in the spring split, even with a change in personnel. I get that Poom probably practiced a lot of Senna in the spring split because you had Manui here in the bot lane, and he's obviously known for playing some out-of-there picks. He plays marksman as little as he possibly can get away with in the AD carry role, which is great. No flame towards that. But Tomo on Ornn is not what I want to see. That is just, I don't get it. I don't understand why you would take the player that, quite frankly, single-handedly won you your series last week and put him on Ornn in the bot lane and just, ask someone else to win the game. Especially with Poom being the one that you're kind of asking on the Senna in game number 1, because he was really bad last week. And he was a little bit better, I would say, this week, but not a ton better, and Tomo didn't have the same kind of explosive offense, so now you're looking at Tenacity or Yukino or Young to really step up and carry, and those players can do that, but they didn't in this series. Young's gonna get dud of the series here. I don't think he was horrible. He was really aggressive on the Corki in game 1, a ton of kills and a ton of deaths. It's just the kind of game that you get when you feel like you are the win condition for the team. When you look at this draft, okay, your bot laner's playing Ornn, your jungler's playing Maokai, and Tenacity can do things on Volibear, but it's not like he's gonna carry the game. Yeah, you kind of do have to be the guy on this team for Dignitas on the Corki in game number 1, and Young, again, I just don't think, I think if he reined it in just a tad bit in that first game, it could have been a bit better. He got caught way too frequently, even if he was dealing damage, and then the LeBlanc was just very underwhelming in game number 2. He really had no prio at all in the mid lane matchup, and he really didn't create any plays. It just wasn't a very good series for Young, but Yukino was out jungled. He just was lacking a lot of tempo and a lot of pressure, especially at the beginning of game number 2 when he's playing something like Xin Zhao. Tenacity, I think, could have theoretically been better, even if I don't think he was the problem, and you take your best player right now in Tomo, the one who has performed the best through the beginning part of this split, and again, you put him on Ornn in game number 1. I get the Zeri is slightly better in game number 2, but I'm gonna stick on this point because I just think it's a pretty major mistake. DSG is just one of those teams where you have to accept the bad with the good. The good is still definitely there for this team, and there are still avenues for them to come out as one of the more dangerous teams in the NACL, but the consistency is not, and these losses have become less and less shocking as they've happened more and more throughout the year. And then for Winthrop on the other side, this is a really big win. They're not the worst team in the NACL. I think that's become abundantly clear. Do I think that they're going to be top 6 or somewhere in that range? It's a little bit yet to be determined. This is a very nice win, and DSG is struggling. Do I think Winthrop projects better going into the future? I really don't know yet, but the success of these players in collegiate definitely helped kind of establish their play style and really establish kind of the mentality that they want to play with. It gave them the confidence they needed to come up to this level and do really well. And if they can just carry that over and continue that, against teams that are about as good as DSG, like CCG or, like Blue Otter, then I think this could very well be a team that ends up competing for a top 4 or even 5 spot. Alright, but that is going to do it for my NACL week number 3 overview and analysis video here in the summer split. Up on the screen, the standings after 3 weeks of action. Any ties, as you know, are just broken alphabetically. I'm not trying to show any sort of favoritism here. That is reflected in the power rankings instead. That's my personal opinion of where these teams land. You can see that on the right of every single one of these teams' boxes. Power rank is their number between 1 and 10 that I personally power rank them at. Change is how they have changed from last week to this week. So we can go over risers and followers, and one thing that I think might be a little bit surprising to people is just the small amount of changes that I made, the lack of changes that I'm making to my power rankings at the moment, because I honestly don't think that I'm sold on basically anybody in the NACL. I feel pretty confident about the top 5 being the top 5. I think Dragonsteel at 1, FlyQuest at 2. That feels good. Fear has really not proven anything that they shouldn't be number 3, right? They have only been good throughout this split so far. Liquid was better than Supernova this week. They're going to move up to 4, but Supernova was close. It was a good series, so they're going to move down to 5. They're going to stay in that top 5. I think that's pretty clear. Everything else, kind of whatever order you want to have them in at the moment. DSG is obviously a team that's really underperforming, but as was the case last split, I kept them pretty high in my power rankings for basically the entire year, and that proved correct in the playoffs. I think that they will get better, but there are real problems on that roster right now that Tomo and Tenacity can't solve on their own. And then CCG is going to stay at 7 because they've only lost to good teams. Like, they've essentially only played actual good teams throughout this year. I really have no idea how they would perform against other teams towards the bottom, like AoE, and that's something that I'm kind of waiting on before I drop them down into the bottom 2. But the bottom 3 are going to stay essentially the same here. Blue Otter at 8. One of the other movements, Winthrop is going to jump AoE. That became clear. AoE is the number 10 team in the league until proven otherwise. They cannot win anything right now. Their consistency is super low, and I just don't know if they have the top-end talent to be able to overcome their consistency problems. It feels like at least 2 players on the team are going to be playing poor at any given time, and they don't really have a star that can, like, fix that. So, you know, I'm a bit concerned about them. They're clearly number 10, but Winthrop, I am taking that wait-and-see approach on. Like I said, DSG is not a team I really believe in a ton at the moment, and so Winthrop's win is obviously very good, but before I push them into the top 6 or top 7, like I think a lot of other people will, I do just want to see it be repeatable, and I want to see DSG's losses be a bit more repeatable. I want to see their problems not get fixed. That's when I'm going to start to get concerned. So again, a lack of changes, but it's more of a to be determined. Like, I'm definitely going to take these results this week into account in future weeks when we do the power rankings. If DSG continues to struggle, I'm going to be quicker to pull the trigger on them. If Winthrop continues to look good, I'll be quicker to push them up. It's all going to be dependent on what happens from here, but, you know, I don't want to make too many drastic changes before we've seen kind of the consequences of these games. So let me know if you agree or disagree with that, you know, rationale down in the comment section below, but it's time to move into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 3. This was a pretty difficult one. I think that there were a lot of good players this week, but player of the week for me is going to go to Jenkins, the top laner for Team Liquid Challengers. I thought he had the best single game of anybody in the NACL over the course of this week. He just was really, really good on that volley baron. He was really consistent throughout the whole series. Maybe not as flashy as some of the other players that are going to get some honorable mentions here, but I think Jenkins more than earned his player of the week. If you wanted to give it to XU, the jungler for Fear X Starforge, I think that's a very reasonable outcome. He was fantastic, especially in Game 3 on that Nidalee. Clearly the best Nidalee game in the NACL so far this year, and excited to be able to say that. And then Winnie, I mean, a 2-0 for Winthrop was really huge, and I mean, it really kind of raised the level of where we could expect this team to land. I thought he had a couple of really great games, was definitely the primary guy in the back half of game number 1, which definitely helped, and I think generally it would have been a crime if I didn't give him an honorable mention. And so, you know, if you wanted to give either of them player of the week, I think that that's totally fine. I'm going to give it to Jenkins because, again, I thought his individual game number 1 in that series was the best that anybody played this week, but, you know, there were a lot of good options. There were a lot of good players in the NACL this week. And then dud of the week, unfortunately for me, is going to go to NXI, the jungler for AoE. The team is just kind of a disaster. Jungle mid has not been particularly synergistic over the course of this split so far, even with Cupid having a couple of good games here or there. It's never really felt like they're on the same page, and NXI is a pretty big part of that. I think he has pretty clearly been the worst jungler in the NACL so far this split, and if that continues, AoE is going to continue to be a bottom 2 team, which is really not ideal, especially in a situation where, you know, next year the format changes and NACL Tier 2 becomes more important because now you can qualify for that guest spot in the LCS. So certainly not ideal, but NXI is dud of the week, and Jenkins is my player of the week, but that is going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the NACL on this channel, we post about all 4 of the major regions as well. So LCS, LEC, LCK, LPL, every single week we cover all of them on this channel. Hit subscribe and hit that bell if you are interested when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all